Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This episode is a really interesting conversation with one of my all-time favorite design writers, Justin McGuirk. Justin is currently the chief curator at the Design Museum in London, where he staged some really fascinating exhibitions like the recent shows Fear and Love, Reactions to a Complex World, and California Designing Freedom. But before that, he was a design critic or a design writer where he wrote about design for The Guardian. He was the director of Strelka Press and the editor of Icon magazine. He also teaches in the Design Curating and Writing program at the Design Academy Eindhoven and published Radical Cities, a book about the emerging architecture of Latin America. In this episode, Justin and I talk about his background and how he started writing about design and his move from writing to curating, especially how those two activities are different ways to work with ideas. We also talk about modes of criticism and design's sometimes troubled relationship with problem solving. I'm a big fan of Justin's work and writing and just find the way he writes about design so refreshing and probing, and I find myself always wishing that he was writing more. So I was really excited for this one and was so glad to get the chance to talk to him and think that you'll enjoy it too. So here is my conversation with Justin McGuirk. Like I just said, I've been following you and your work for a couple years now, but I don't actually know much about your background or how you got into all of this. And something that's always interesting to me when I talk to people who are critics or curators in the design field is what interest came first for them? Was it design or was it writing and criticism?
That's a good question. I have what I consider to be a fairly conventional way into this discipline.
Okay.
Which is that I studied art history.
Okay.
Which is, traditionally would have been the way in. Mm-hmm. Actually, I mean, I think traditionally there was less of the kind of character who studied design or architecture and then decided to become a writer. I mean, right. If you were going to do that, you probably came out of an art history background. That's certainly the case for people like Rainer Banham, mm-hmm. who studied and taught art history and then architecture history. So I did that, and actually, as a teenager, I wanted to be an artist, but also was pretty good at writing. And I tried going to art college. I did study painting for a year, but did not want to miss out on an academic degree, and ended up doing a master's in art history. And I suppose it was, the shift happened in my first couple of years after graduating when I was, working in galleries at kind of entry level and even museums at kind of entry level. And, wasn't really feeling the curatorial vibe actually, because a lot of my, one just assumes. It actually took me a while for it to occur to me that I could make a living writing.
Yeah.
In fact, that was a delusion, of course. But the initial goal was to get a job at a gallery or a museum, which is what my colleagues were doing.
Okay.
And I suppose it's ironic, or it's the circle of life, that 20 years later I now find myself in a museum, having originally rejected the idea.
Right.
Because in my first forays in museum work, I thought, curating is going to be way too administrative and logistical for me. I guess because when you come in at the entry level, it can be, if you're assisting people, mm-hmm. that kind of work can, if you're not a committed curator, could put you off.
Yeah.
I got a job at the Architectural Association as a junior editor in 1999. Okay. And that was when I studied, and that's when I realized I'd always been interested in architecture, even since I was a kid, but that's when it really kind of solidified in my mind that mm-hmm. something I wanted to spend more time doing. And to make a long story short, I mean, I did go off and live in New York for a while and worked in publishing, but eventually got into magazines and started writing properly. I mean, started really being a journalist in the early 2000s, and then was part of a group of critics, young critics at the time, who set up Icon magazine,
Right.
and worked there as an editor and a writer for several years, and ended up becoming the editor of the magazine for a few years, and then kind of had, I guess, what you would call journalism fatigue, and decided that I didn't want to just be constantly producing another issue of the magazine and just yet another article, and
Right.
I wanted to do something longer and deeper and book-like. And that's when I started doing my book on Latin American cities.
Okay.
Meanwhile, I was still a practicing critic and journalist. I was the design critic at The Guardian for a few years. And then I suppose, I started to develop what we would describe as a more fluid or kind of a portfolio career. And I curated an exhibition, or an installation really, at the Venice Biennale in 2012, related to my research on the Latin America book. It was the Torre David exhibition.
Right.
That made something of a big noise, and then it was really from there that curating started to open up as another option.
Okay.
And at the same time, I mean, 2012 was kind of a crazy year for me. I mean, I was working on the book. I was working on the show in Venice. It was also the year I launched Strelka Press.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Which, the small kind of digital publishing house that was publishing the work of architecture and design critics, some of whom no doubt you've interviewed.
Yeah, I love what they're doing over there, actually.
And that was another interesting experiment in architecture and design writing and publishing. But I don't know, maybe that I feel like that's my background.
Yeah.
Before we bring it right up to the present.
Yeah, I have a couple if it's okay.
An interesting question, which was about which came first.
Yeah.
The writing or design. And I suppose the answer to that the very long-winded answer to that question is writing.
Yeah, right. So that actually kind of leads nicely into my other question. I want to talk about curating in a little bit, but I'm interested. I'm kind of curious about. This question is going to sound overly simplified, and so I apologize. But was there a moment when you felt like you could call yourself a design critic, or where did I know you mentioned that you always were interested in architecture, but where did that switch from, spending years studying art history to moving into something that was more design focused?
Well, it happened when I started working at the AA.
Okay.
Because I was just, I was editing little magazines and books about architecture, and that's when I really started to segue from one world into the other.
Okay.
And then there was another segue, really. I mean, it's not a shift from architecture to design, but I added design to my portfolio gradually while I was at Icon magazine. I think all of us who started that magazine had come out of architecture, actually.
Okay.
But felt that there was a lot to be said about design that wasn't being said at the time, or maybe there was a kind of approach to writing about design that we wanted to try that felt like it needed to be done.
Yeah, I mean, that sets up a bunch of why I really like you and your work, actually, because I think that your writing about design was always kind of very different than a lot of the other design writing that when I discovered you, it seemed like this big revelation of that there were other ways to talk about these things. And one of my frustrations in kind of the design discourse, especially the graphic design discourse. And again, this is an overgeneralization, is that it often focuses on kind of a surface level critique. It's looking at typography and colors and companies redesigning their logos, and often doesn't ask kind of deeper questions about why these things exist or why these changes were made, etc. And that's something I always liked about your writing, is I felt like you were kind of talking about those things in that way. And the piece that I'm thinking of as I'm talking about this is your piece, I think it was called Honeywell, I'm Home, essentially about the Internet of Things. And so I'm curious kind of how that way of thinking about design, or that there were these other ways to talk about design, where did that come from, or how did that start to become your mode of looking at the world, I guess?
Well, I think it came from a broad cultural frame of reference.
Okay.
I should add, don't think I'm unique in that quality. There are, I would say there are, plenty of design critics and writers who would look beyond the surface. But I think the interesting thing about writing both about architecture and design is that that ability to engage with society, with notions of the public. I don't know, and I think probably the art historical dimension helps to some degree as well, because somehow in art history one is always allying the artwork to the surrounding cultural context.
Right.
What was happening when this painting was being made?
Yeah.
And so that's always what I've wanted to do, is to try and, in reading the object, what we're really trying to do, I guess, is read society, or read the particular cultural, direction of movement that object indicates.
I mean, so that's, I guess this is a good place to kind of talk about what you're doing now, actually, because I was hearing your background now, I'm less surprised, but when you took the job of curator at the Design Museum, that seemed like a big shift from what you were doing before. Now, kind of putting it in context, it makes a lot more sense. So I guess kind of briefly, what were you looking for in kind of moving away from strictly writing or criticism into a position like you have now? And then the larger question that I have is how you think about your role as a curator to bring together objects like this to look at society. How is that different than, writing an essay, I guess? You know what I mean? That was kind of a weird way to phrase that.
No, I know exactly what you mean. And the first thing to say is that it was a big shift.
Okay.
It was a big shift. It was a bigger shift than I thought. I mean, it was very, it's not hard to make a compelling case about why someone with my background would be an interesting person to have at a museum like the Design Museum, if one makes the case that it's all about ideas. If one were to make the case that it's about the craft of curating, then I probably wouldn't have been the right person to. But for me, it was the idea that the museum could be a forum of ideas, and those ideas didn't all have to manifest themselves as exhibitions. That actually the public program could, and publishing and exhibitions could all contribute, as they do at other museums, to the cultural statements being made. So in a way, I offered myself up as a person who knows the landscape and likes to take on relevant topics and contribute to a discussion of ideas. My pitch was that the Design Museum should be the center of the global debate around design.
I like that.
But of course, it was a big shift, and it was a big it was a big learning curve for me in terms of the craftsmanship of making exhibitions, which has been, I must say, a very fun learning curve for me. It's tremendously fun to move from writing on paper to writing in space, and talking to people through objects and conceiving of the argument through objects.
Yeah.
I mean, there are papers or essays that I've written with arguments that work on paper that probably wouldn't work in objects. Mm-hmm. And you know, that you mentioned the smart home essay. That's much stronger as an essay than it is as an exhibition.
Right.
I know that because I'm thinking about an exhibition now about the home, the idea of the home. And my first draft of that exhibition as an idea was much better as an idea than it was as an exhibition. And it was in trying to set out my notion of this idea that our sense of what home means is changing because of things like, you know, nomadic behavior or smart home technology or Airbnb or the sense that privacy is diminishing our, you know, our notion of home. All of these things are fascinating, and they are all true. But if you try and spell those things out in objects, it's actually much harder than to write a book.
Well, so how this is exactly kind of what I wanted to talk to you about, is this idea of curating as a type of critical activity, or taking a position around a set of ideas and then, you know, kind of finding objects that support them in a way. And so I have two questions, and I'll be upfront that I have not been to the Design Museum, so I've been admiring it from afar. But I'm thinking of the Fear and Love exhibition as something that seems related to what you're talking about, where that very clearly had a point of view that you were trying to communicate. And so my two questions are, and you can speak about that exhibition specifically or more generally, whichever you want. But I'm kind of interested in the audience for the museum and what types of people come through and how you think about communicating these ideas to that audience. You know, is it mostly people who are fairly design literate? And then how much of your view or your ideas around this are coming across? You know, how much of this is kind of, you know, I don't know, opinion, not opinion based, but, you know, taking a critical stance?
Well, excellent questions. I mean, we had 800,000 people come through the museum in the first year. And the honest answer is we don't know who they are. You know, we're still doing surveys and things, trying to figure out who our audience is, because it's certainly a bigger audience than we used to have in the old building. Mm-hmm. And that means it's a different audience, and we're trying to figure out who it is. I must say that those kind of conversations about who exactly the audience is are coming into play much more now than they did when I came up with the idea for Fear and Love, which was an exhibition where actually we gave ourselves license to not have to be too popular. We did say when we opened the museum, we wanted to open with a critical position statement, and we didn't care too much about the size of that audience for that exhibition, because it was much more important to us to put a stake in the ground.
Oh, interesting.
And the stake in the ground was to celebrate design, but also complicate it.
Yeah, I love that.
Challenge people's preconceptions about what they might find in a design museum. That if they were they were not going to come and see an exhibition of chairs.
Right.
But actually, they would come and see an exhibition about the relevance of design to the way the world is changing. And so Fear and Love was quite a complex portrait of design's role in a rapidly changing world, and one where we wanted to kind of foreground issues and context much more than objects. So in going down the installation route and inviting 11 architects and designers to come to the museum and make installations, I very explicitly said to them, this is not about putting objects on a plinth.
Mm.
Okay, this is about the context in which you work. And the reason why I think that's important is because, design engages with really complex issues.
Yeah.
And any object is part of a kind of complex web of side effects, histories, provenances. If you wanted to talk in kind of sustainability terms, every object is a story about where those materials came from, where they're going to go, how they are spread across the world. It's quite a complex picture, and I just wanted to dwell on that for a moment.
Yeah.
And also I wanted to present design as a discipline where the stakes are high.
Yeah.
I wanted to challenge the idea of design as being style.
Right.
And so had installations about, obviously, this is where the fear comes into the title.
Yeah.
Exhibition about automation. That clearly there's a societal fear of automation at this moment. There were exhibits about online dating platforms and how they change people's behavior, about recycling textiles, about death, about food. So big complex issues, and presented in installation forms. So not as a kind of discrete object, but in a more theatrical way, in a more artistic way, actually.
Right. I mean, that, I have like 5 different things I want to ask you now based on that. I had read an interview that you had done. I think it was about Fear and Love, where you said something to the effect that design has a more complicated relationship to the world than designers like to believe sometimes, or something. I'm misquoting you a little bit, but you said something like that, and I'm sorry to kind of quote back.
It sounds roughly like something I would say.
Okay, good. And I think that's something that's really interesting, in that design is often seen as this kind of good thing, or especially in graphic design education, it's presented as a type of problem solving.
Yes.
But it's not. I don't mean to be too negative or to take this down a dark road, but I think that's what was really interesting about your exhibition, or what I was able to see of the exhibition, is that you kind of attempted to articulate that complicated relationship that you're talking about. And
it's true. I mean, just to give you I do believe, that design has the potential to, quote unquote, make the world a better place.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, I'm not cynical about design, but I do think it's complicated because, everything you put into the world has consequences and side effects, even when you're solving a problem, again, quote unquote. And sometimes we don't even know what the consequences of those things are until much later.
Right.
So a good example would be, plastic in the oceans.
Right.
Okay. So my big "we're doomed" moment was in November last year, when it emerged that scientists had discovered plastic in the most minute form of sea life, 11 kilometers deep.
Right.
At that moment, I thought, okay, this is not going to be an easy one to solve. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, and then you think, how did we get there? And obviously, we know that we've let plastic as a disposable material run riot in our convenience culture. And designers are, in their own small way, complicit in that, because they're good at designing very convenient, efficient, seductive forms of packaging. Okay, that's their job when that's the brief. It's not necessarily it's not designers' fault that that way of life became globalized and completely unsustainable.
Yeah.
And then along comes a very well-meaning and right-thinking company like Patagonia and says, well, let's turn let's recycle plastic bottles into fleeces. And everybody says, what a brilliant idea. And then 20 years later, or I don't know, 15 years later, they discover that plastic microfibers are being sucked through our washing machines from the fleeces into the ocean,
Right.
and they're consumed by, microorganisms. And that's when you think design is complicated.
Yeah. I have a very I'm asking this question completely, almost not as a interviewer anymore, completely as a selfish question, because what you're saying is completely resonating with the types of conversations that I have with people on the podcast, with my students, with my friends who are designers, and I'm trying to think of the best way to articulate this, but I'm very much interested in the relationship between the critic and the designer, or between criticism and theory and actual practice. And I'm from the critical side, from the point of view of a critic, I agree with you 100%. And these are all the things that I'm talking about. But then when I switch to my designer side, making seductive packaging or figuring out new ways to reuse things, it almost becomes paralyzing in a sense, because it's like, well, what is the role of the designer anymore? Because all of this stuff is just, it can almost feel overwhelming that all of this stuff is just doing more harm than good. And
I sympathize. Yeah.
And so I'm okay, good. I'm curious if you have any thoughts. I'm not asking for a clear answer here, but how a practicing designer who is working at a place, for example, where they have to make packaging for something, how they can kind of move through that world while also being critical, skeptical, but also making a living.
I think I have two answers to that question.
Okay.
One a little bit more oblique, but I would say designers can influence those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
They can. It is within the designer's gift to propose, more sustainable forms of packaging than was listed on the brief, mm-hmm. for example, or more sustainable forms of production or printing, or, if someone comes to you and says, I want this X and Y, and you think it's unhealthy, and you propose an equally sexy version, which is, mm-hmm. W and R.
Yeah.
That's in your gift. It's in your gift to make the suggestion anyway.
Mm-hmm.
The more complex response is that it depends what kind of critic I would be, mm-hmm. because, there are different kinds of critics. There are the critics who are kind of like industry watchdogs.
Right.
And who, are naming and shaming people who are doing environmental damage or whatever. And then there's also criticism as a form of I don't know, how can I put it? There's criticism as cultural meaning.
Right. Yeah.
As semiotics, or, there's Roland Barthes, who's going to write an essay about, Italian packaging or
mm-hmm.
a poster
mm-hmm.
for Italian products, and what the visual language of that poster symbolizes or signifies. And then there's criticism about the effects of those things in the world.
Right.
They're not
Yeah.
always the same thing. So I don't know. I mean, it just feels, I suppose, the cultural meaning aspect never goes away. If you're a good critic, that is your job. It's for me, being a critic is about finding cultural meaning.
Hmm.
uh, trying to understand what an object says about the culture and society that produces it.
I, I,
Uh, then, somehow it feels more important than ever to talk about the side effects as well.
I'm curious how I kind of want to shift a little bit, but keep this thread going because you also teach and you're working with students who are training to become critics or curators and do this kind of work. How do you think about kind of teaching that or presenting students with all these different ways that you can be a critic or these different positions that a critic can take?
Well, it's true. I mean, I teach less now than I used to, but I
Okay.
teach at the Design Academy Eindhoven, um,
Hmm.
at the Design Curating Writing Masters. And I think the best way to do that is to present them with different forms of criticism.
Hmm.
To look at the the way different critics have approached their field. Um, I mean, it's interesting, and there are historical shifts. I mean, if you think about the way that Rainer Banham wrote about design, not so much architecture but design,
Hmm.
um, I would say that it's difficult to write like that about design these days in some respect because for him, in the 1960s, you could still point to design
Yeah.
as kind of to some degree socially liberating
Yeah.
in the sense that he would say that the washing machine liberated his mother from having to boil clothes in a copper pot.
Right.
So, this sense that all mod cons in the home meant free time, and that meant leisure time,
Hmm.
um,
Oh, that's
was
interesting.
was quite liberating.
Yeah.
It's difficult to make the same case now for consumer products, and especially if you look at the new products coming into the home, that it's not so much about efficiency anymore, or really it's just about overloaded functionality,
Yeah.
data collection. So it's like,
Right. Well, I think it's interesting because it kind of ties back to what we were talking about earlier about the kind of position you took at the design museum and wanting this to be this kind of place to deconstruct people's notions of design. And I think this applies to teaching design criticism or design writing also. I talk with the other faculty that I work with about how fast the design industry is changing and that even our definitions of design are changing, that it's so hard to teach students, especially students who are sometimes coming in with really concrete examples of design being logos and books and websites to others who are thinking more systematically, that I can't imagine teaching people how to talk about this stuff or pick apart this stuff when design's definition is completely expanding. I'm thinking of Mark Wigley and Beatrix Colomina, Are We Human? That the whole world is encrusted with a geological layer of design. Is that a challenge that you find?
yes. um,
Do you know what I
I,
mean?
I think the interesting thing about the Wigley and Colomina position is that it's easier to talk about design in those terms if you're not actually in the design world,
Mm.
which they are slightly outside of.
Yeah.
So design, I think the challenge is design as a word,
Right.
and particularly in English, where it has a kind of infinite elasticity. Because we use it we use it in a kind of more prolific way than other languages,
Yeah.
than some other languages, where they have more specific definitions of what design means. We can literally design anything. As Hal Foster once said, from jeans, as in denim, to jeans,
Right.
as
Yeah.
in, um,
Yeah.
you know, as human cells or whatever.
Right.
And that can be confusing. I mean, to some degree, though, it is true that the industry has expanded and the sense of what design is has also expanded. And I mean, you just have to think about something like software,
Right.
and let alone, service design. And you start to realize that every potential experience we have can be designed in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So much of the way we negotiate the world now is through interfaces and screens.
Right.
All of those experiences have been designed. You walk into a supermarket or you walk into a bank, and if it's a good bank, the way you encounter that space, or the hierarchy of employees that you're going to encounter on your journey to that till has all been designed in some way, through some experience design. And then you're right, it becomes bewildering, but also amazing. I mean,
right.
Sometimes you think that design really does have this phenomenal influence on the world.
Right.
Most of the time, a lot of this stuff is happening by accident or in spite of design.
Right. This leads in really nicely to a question that I ask everybody, and it kind of leads into the final part of the conversation. But I'm really curious about what you think are the issues, the topics, subjects that designers should be talking more about and thinking about in their practice, but then also these issues that the critics and writers who are looking at this stuff, what are the things we should be thinking about right now?
I find that such a hard question.
I know.
The reason why is because I have a particularly broad spectrum of interests.
Okay.
I mean, I write about cities, architecture, product design.
Yeah.
And also about design in a more kind of nebulous sense. I mean, I do think that design's relation to the planet and this emergent term Anthropocene is unavoidable.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that we are gradually encrusting the next layer of the earth with the byproducts of our lifestyles is something that we need to think much more deeply about. And I never feel more depressed about design as a discipline than when I walk through an airport or some shopping malls, not all, but some, and you just look at the proliferation of stuff.
Yeah.
And you think we're doomed.
Yeah.
On the other hand, when people make the rather simplistic argument, oh, not another chair,
mm-hmm.
I think, well, why not another chair? I mean, you don't turn the tap of culture off. There are always new forms, new ways of making new materials, new manufacturing processes. It's not like we need more chairs. I mean, maybe if we stockpile them, we have enough to sit on. But then if we stockpile all our books, we have enough to read for the rest of our lives. You don't turn culture off.
Right. I love that.
So I do find it, without having some kind of, Stalinist style central committee of product approval, the free market will do what it does. And it's 10 million entrepreneurs trying to make a buck with things that they need designers to make seductive.
Right.
And I don't see any way out of that except to find more sustainable ways of making those things and more recyclable ways.
Right.
To be deeply boring about it, there's like 7% of the world's gold reserves are trapped in electronics.
Mm.
There's a tremendous amount of material out there, but it's been put together in ways that's very hard to unpick.
Right.
So we need to get better at that. We need to get better at not gluing electronics together and making things in ways that are easier to disassemble and reuse and melt down and reshape.
Yeah. In an attempt to not end this on a completely we're doomed note.
Also boring.
I'm the last question that I kind of ask everybody that I talk to is I'm curious who the writers, the critics, if you were assembling a reading list, who are the people that have really influenced you or the people you return to again and again, or have kind of influenced how you think about all of these things, if we were kind of putting a reading list together of the people that, people should read?
Oh my God.
I know.
That's hard.
I know.
God, whoever I list now, I'm going to kind of kick myself later for not mentioning the people I really care about.
You would not be surprised how many people say that exact same thing when I ask that question. You would think by now I would know to warn people before I talk to them.
Well, I'm vaguely, traditionally there are a lot of B's on my list. So Rainer Banham was tremendously influential to me, as was Roland Barthes. It depends on the topic, really. When it comes to, certainly that's when it comes to my approach to writing about products. But then people like Lefebvre were influential when it comes to writing about the city. Marshall Berman, Richard Sennett. Richard Sennett is.
Oh yeah, actually, when I was researching, rereading some of your pieces before this conversation, I reread your review of his book, The Craftsman, which was a book that I loved and had forgotten that you had written about it.
That was only a small thing, but I've just finished, or I'm about to finish a longer piece about a new book he's doing about the city. It's something I've written for the New Yorker, and it's writing about the city is a bit like writing about design. Where do you stop? It's just such an endlessly vast and rich topic.
Yeah.
I had the problem with that piece where I got to 3,000 words and I was like, I feel like I've just started.
Yeah. I know I said that last question was the last question, but you just said that you're writing something for the New Yorker. Are you still doing much writing, or how does writing kind of fit into your, or let's say public writing fit into your work now?
Well, I did slow down after joining the museum. I kind of had this notion that I would continue to write, and found that actually, I really had to slow down on the writing front, because it just became a distraction from the things I was meant to be thinking about. And I have written catalog essays and things, for Fear and Love and for the California show. But I'd like to write a little bit more. It's a little bit dangerous because, it can be a distraction, but I just kind of need it.
Yeah.
Need to do it. I really, that's why I wanted to do something a little bit longer about this book. I have no interest in kind of short form journalism or opinion pieces particularly. I just kind of feel these days, if I'm going to write something, I just want to write about things that I write about. I'm not that interested in opinion. I'm much more interested in criticism.
Yeah. I think that's great. That was one of the, this is actually a really nice way to kind of wrap all of this up, because as excited as I was to see you going to the Design Museum, it was a little bit depressing for me being on, across the ocean, that it's harder for me to go see your work than to read it when it's online. And I missed seeing your writing regularly. So to hear that is still something you're interested in doing, and in, a little bit longer form, or something that's kind of straight criticism, is exciting, because like I began, I'm a big fan of your work and your writing especially, and I have to get to London to see one of your shows, and just the way that you think about all of these things has been very influential to me, and I think a lot of the strands and themes of this podcast have come out of your work. So I'm really glad that we finally got to kind of have this conversation, that I got to talk to you a little bit. And so thanks for your work, and also thanks for this conversation. It was really, really great for me.
Well, thank you very much for your kind comments. I enjoyed it a lot. I feel like like everything else, I feel like we just started that conversation.
I know. This episode was recorded on January 19th, 2018. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.